there's no European troops that will fill the gap. There was never much backfill on any weapons they needed rushed to the battlefield in the first place. Ukraine was losing. But the fundamental issue here is Ukraine's sovereignty, and there is none because of a decision that was made by the United States in coordination with its Ukrainian USAID-sponsored partners in 2013 to topple the elected government of Viktor Yanukovych in a coup, which culminated in early 2014. And with that coup, Ukraine didn't shift from Russian-controlled to democratic. It shifted from neutral, a neutral country that had friendly economic relations with its powerful nuclear-armed neighbor, which seems to be a smart form of diplomacy. It also keeps energy prices down for a population that is poorer than in much of the rest of Europe. But then they switched to Western-controlled, NATOized beachhead of anti-Russian militarism, which is just a disaster for your country. The disastrous stage was set in 2014, and Ukraine then complemented Israel and Taiwan as imperial bulwarks. And as soon as the United States decides that they're not going to send a weapons package, your country faces existential doom. That's the choice that they made. And the Ukraine, and Aaron, I want maybe you can expound on this. The Ukrainian government, particularly of Zelensky, leaned on the Biden-Obama faction that ushered in the Maidan coup, and large sectors of Ukrainian quote-unquote civil society, the USAID-funded so-called independent media outlets and NGOs, weighed in the Russiagate hoax against Trump. And so by leaning so hard on one faction, one power mafia in Washington, you're setting the stage for your demise as a servant, as an imperial proxy with no sovereignty that's no longer neutral. You're setting your stage for your demise as soon as they're out of power.
Yeah, well, this is the sad thing, is a faction of Ukrainians got caught up in their Democratic Party backers' partisan battle with Trump. And recall, who helped put these people in power? It was people like Victoria Nuland, who was serving in a senior State Department role, a major player in the 2014 Maidan coup, to the point where there's that leaked audio intercepted of her and the U.S. ambassador basically selecting who should be to the top Ukrainian leaders in a new government. That's how influential the U.S. was in the coup camp, is that Victoria Nuland took it upon herself to pick who should be in and out of government. And the people who came to power in Ukraine after they took power in 2014, they continued to double down by basically colluding with the DNC in 2016 against Trump. You had Ukrainian officials meeting with DNC officials and putting out what turned out to be likely concocted claims about Paul Manafort taking secret illicit payments. And this was celebrated openly at the time. They admitted it. This is a headline from the Financial Times in 2016, in August 2016. Ukraine's leaders campaign against pro-Putin Trump. And they were bragging about it. They were taking credit for the fact that by that point, Paul Manafort was forced to resign because they had leaked this so-called ledger of him receiving secret payments from Yanukovych and his allies. And amazingly, this guy right here, pictured, Sergei Lashenko, he's now an advisor to Zelensky. So it didn't occur to these people. I wonder, did they think that maybe this would eventually come back against them, like this blowback? Yeah. I don't think Trump forgot about this. Now, the problem is the U.S. corporate media, every time they talk about the claim that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election, they always dismiss that as a Russian conspiracy or Russian disinformation. But the Financial Times is not a Kremlin mouthpiece. And this guy here, Sergei Lashenko, is not working for the Kremlin. They were bragging about it in 2016. So I don't think the Trump camp's forgotten about this. And I think part of this is blowback for Russiagate and also for Trump's first impeachment, where he was impeached as he froze weapons to Ukraine while also pressuring Ukraine to look into the corruption of the Bidens and also the role of Ukraine in Russiagate, because one thing we also learned recently is that John Brennan, a major player in Russiagate, when he was heading the CIA and effectively controlling Ukrainian intelligence, he used Ukrainian intelligence to help lodge the allegation that Russian hackers hacked the DNC and gave the emails to WikiLeaks. So Ukraine has been used in this partisan battle, and I think that's ultimately what sealed their fate, is like the Trump team finally is taking revenge. And and your point about Ukraine losing its sovereignty in the process. Okay, well, here's one example, and it also speaks to this talking point that people were so offended when Trump called Zelensky a dictator because he hasn't held elections, for example. And you could argue, I'm sympathetic to the argument that it's hard to hold elections during a time of war. But the problem is Zelensky has been acting dictatorial since well before Russia invaded. So this is, for example, a headline from February 2021, a year before Russia invaded. Ukraine shuts TV channels it accuses of spreading Russian disinformation. And that was when Zelensky, again, a year before Russia invaded, shut down 3 television networks that were linked to his political rival Medvedchuk, who was close to Putin. And what this sent the message to ethnic Russians inside Ukraine and to Moscow that basically Zelensky was going to cut off the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine to the point where he wasn't going to allow their TV networks to exist. And the U.S. sent the message that it was on board with this because it cheered what Ukraine did, what Zelensky did. This is February 2021. The U.S. supports Ukraine's efforts to counter Russia's malign influence in line with Ukrainian law in defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Okay, so speaking of sovereignty, this crackdown on free speech, the shutting down of 3 opposition TV networks, this was not done just with Zelensky acting on his own volition. Zelensky's aide later admitted to Time magazine that this was, quote, a welcome gift to the Biden administration. This is from Simon Schuster, who basically embedded with the Zelensky team. He wrote a whole book about Zelensky called The Showman. And this is what Schuster writes. This is from February 2022. Shutting down these TV networks, quote, was also conceived as a welcome gift to the Biden administration, which had made the fight against international corruption a pillar of its foreign policy. As one Zelensky aide put it, the decision to go after Putin's friend Medvedchuk, who was tied to these TV networks, was calculated to fit in with the U.S. agenda. And that's why the U.S. cheered Zelensky shutting down these TV networks, because the Biden administration wanted Zelensky to crack down on his opposition. Because at the time, Medvedchuk, who's close to Putin, was actually, in some polls, leading Zelensky. And they didn't want to have Medvedchuk's TV stations on the air. And so, but Russia took this as basically a sign that Zelensky had no interest in basically allowing the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine, which is sizable, concentrated in the east, to exist. And shortly after that, that's when Russia first started sending troops to its border with Ukraine, culminating finally 1 year later in the invasion. So this welcome gift to the Biden administration by Zelensky helped ultimately welcome a Russian invasion. And it's a good example of what you're talking about, how just Ukraine did lose its sovereignty after 2014, when, as Victoria Nuland bragged about, there were U.S. advisors in so many Ukrainian government ministries, and so much money was flowing from the U.S. into Ukraine that, as Samantha Power later admitted, the U.S. was paying the salaries basically for the Ukrainian public sector, along with, we recently learned, like a majority of Ukrainian so-called independent media outlets.
Like 95%.
Yeah.
These are the same outlets and personnel that say were sponsored by China and Russia. It's pretty ironic. This is the price you pay if you don't have sovereignty. You don't control your own resources. You don't have diplomatic relations with your most powerful neighbor. In fact, you're hostile, and you're totally dependent on a power thousands of miles away. And you've even interfered against one power mafia there. They're going to come for you.
Yeah.
That is the tragedy of Ukraine. And you mentioned Viktor Medvedchuk. He was the founder of the Patriots of Ukraine party. It's so disgusting to see the way that he is and his party are portrayed in U.S. media. It's as if they're just this Russian foreign implant, when Ukraine was constructed as a country like many other countries, it's an invented country, like so many countries, that had like 35 to 40% of the population with deep ties to Russia on their border that spoke Russian. Then you have in the West the population of Galicia and Carpathia from Lviv, who are, embody the Ukrainian nationalism that has dominated the government since the Maidan coup, and which denied national rights to 35 to 40% of the whole population. If you look back at the past Ukrainian election, see who voted for Medvedchuk and who voted for the nationalist candidate. It was the last Ukrainian election before Maidan. I think, what was it, 2011? That tells you what kind of country Ukraine is, and it sets the stage for a kind of civil war. And that's what was happening in the Donbass when Russia intervened. This war was really about the Donbass. It wasn't about taking over Ukraine and then moving on to Poland and the Baltic states. And the West couldn't understand that. But the West was complicit, if not actively involved, in the denial of rights to an entire, almost half of the Ukrainian population, starting with its leadership, Medvedchuk, who, after having his TV stations banned, was captured and tortured by the Ukrainian SBU. He's now in Russia thanks to a prisoner exchange deal. This is part of the truth that Trump landed on when he accused Zelensky of being a dictator. Zelensky effectively is a Western-backed dictator at this point. And like so many other Western-backed dictators, he could pay the ultimate price. Saddam Hussein, backed by the CIA and the Reagan administration against Iran. Manuel Noriega, former CIA asset, backed by Carter's CIA, taken out by George H.W. Bush, and whose son took out Saddam Hussein. I mean, there are so many of these Western puppets who paid the ultimate price.